It's 1867, and the United States has just agreed to pay $7.2 million for a frozen wasteland twice the size of Texas. Critics call it Seward's Folly and Seward's Icebox, mocking the Secretary of State who championed the purchase. Newspapers ridicule the idea of paying good money for nothing but ice, polar bears, and a few scattered fur traders. Fast forward 150 years, and that folly has yielded over $1 trillion in resources: oil, gold, fish, timber, and strategic military positioning that would prove invaluable in 2 world wars and the Cold War. But Alaska's story doesn't begin with its purchase by the United States. It's a tale that stretches back more than 15,000 years, encompassing indigenous civilizations that thrived in one of Earth's harshest environments: Russian imperial ambitions in the New World, gold rush fever that rivaled California's, and a transformation from forgotten territory to vital state that encapsulates the entire sweep of American expansion and identity. This is the untamed history of Alaska, America's last frontier. Long before Alaska was Russian or American, it was home to diverse indigenous peoples who had mastered survival in one of the planet's most challenging environments. The story begins at least 15,000 years ago, possibly much earlier, when the first humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge, a massive strip of land that connected Asia to North America during the last ice age when sea levels were dramatically lower. These weren't hapless wanderers stumbling into a new continent. They were sophisticated hunter-gatherers who deliberately expanded their territory, following game animals and adapting to new environments with remarkable skill. When the ice sheets began to retreat and sea levels rose, the land bridge disappeared beneath what we now call the Bering Strait. But the people remained, diversifying into distinct cultures across Alaska's varied landscapes. By the time Europeans arrived, Alaska was home to numerous indigenous groups, each adapted to their specific environment. The Inupiat and Yupik peoples dominated the Arctic and subarctic coasts, hunting whales, seals, and walrus in one of Earth's harshest climates. Their ingenuity was extraordinary. They developed technologies like the kayak, the toggle harpoon, and sophisticated techniques for preserving food and creating clothing that could withstand temperatures of minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit or colder. The Aleut people inhabited the Aleutian Islands, that remarkable chain of volcanic islands stretching 1,200 miles into the Pacific. They were master mariners, navigating treacherous waters in bidarkas, sleek skin boats similar to kayaks, to hunt sea otters, seals, and sea lions. The Aleuts developed a complex society with elaborate ceremonies, sophisticated artwork, and detailed knowledge of the ocean environment. In the interior, Athabascan peoples like the Gwich'in, Tanana, and Koyukon adapted to the subarctic forests and rivers. They followed caribou migrations, fished the salmon runs, and developed intricate trade networks that stretched across thousands of miles. Their knowledge of the land was encyclopedic. They could navigate by stars, read weather patterns, and find food where outsiders would see only wilderness. Along the southeast coast, the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian peoples developed one of the most sophisticated pre-contact cultures in North America. These were not small nomadic bands, but complex societies with hereditary nobility, slavery, elaborate art traditions, and massive cedar plank houses. They carved monumental totem poles that served as family crests and historical records. They accumulated wealth through fishing, trading, and raiding, and displayed it through potlatch ceremonies, massive feasts where hosts demonstrated their status by giving away enormous quantities of goods. The Tlingit controlled trade along the coast and inland, acting as middlemen between coastal and interior peoples. When Russians arrived seeking furs, the Tlingit were not passive victims, but aggressive competitors who fought to maintain their trading monopolies and territorial control. This was Alaska on the eve of European contact, not an empty wilderness, but a land of diverse peoples with ancient roots, sophisticated technologies, and complex social systems perfectly adapted to their environments. The Russian discovery of Alaska was driven by one creature, the sea otter. In the early 18th century, Russian fur traders had expanded across Siberia, following the fur trade to the Pacific coast. In 17th, Danish explorer Vitus Bering, sailing for Russia, led an expedition that made landfall on Alaska's coast. What they found there would change everything. Sea otters whose pelts were so luxurious they were called soft gold. Sea otter fur is the densest of any mammal, up to 1,000,000 hairs per square inch, making it incredibly warm and water resistant. In China, wealthy elites would pay extraordinary prices for these pelts. The rush was on. Russian fur traders, called promyshlenniki, pushed eastward across the Aleutian Islands. Their methods were brutal. They would take Aleut women and children hostage, forcing the men to hunt sea otters for them. Resistance was met with violence. The Aleut population, which may have numbered 25,000 before contact, was decimated by violence, disease, and forced labor. By 1800, fewer than 8,000 remained. In 1799, a merchant named Nikolai Rezanov helped establish the Russian-American Company, a state-sponsored monopoly modeled on the British East India Company. The company received exclusive rights to all Russian territories in North America and effective governmental authority over the region. Its first chief manager, Alexander Baranov, would rule Russian Alaska like a personal fiefdom for nearly 20 years. Baranov was a remarkable figure, part merchant, part explorer, part warrior. He established the settlement of Novo-Arkhangelsk, New Archangel, on Sitka Sound as the capital of Russian America. But he faced a problem. The Tlingit, unlike the Aleuts, who lived on isolated islands, the Tlingit controlled the mainland coast and were not easily intimidated. In 1802, Tlingit warriors attacked and destroyed the original Russian settlement at Sitka, killing nearly everyone. It took Baranov 2 years to return with a fleet of ships and cannons to retake the site in 1804. The Battle of Sitka was one of the last major armed resistances by indigenous peoples to European colonization in North America. Russian Alaska was never a successful colony. It was too remote from Moscow, too expensive to supply, and too difficult to defend. The Russian-American Company struggled to turn a profit once sea otter populations crashed from overhunting. The company tried other ventures. Farming largely failed in Alaska's climate. Coal mining, ice harvesting. Alaskan ice was shipped as far as California and Hawaii, but nothing matched the early fur bonanza. By the 80s, Russia was ready to sell. The Crimean War had drained the treasury. Alaska was nearly impossible to defend and might be seized by Britain in any future conflict. Russia feared losing it for nothing, so why not sell it to the United States, thereby creating a barrier between British Canada and Russia's Pacific holdings? Russian Orthodox missionaries had been more successful than Russian merchants. They established schools, translated religious texts into native languages, and unlike most colonizers, encouraged indigenous people to maintain aspects of their culture us. Today, Russian Orthodox Christianity remains strong in many Alaska Native communities, creating a unique cultural synthesis. Enter William Seward, Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State, and a man of grand vision. Seward believed in American expansion across the Pacific. He had already acquired Midway Island and was eyeing opportunities throughout the Pacific Rim. When Russia indicated willingness to sell Alaska, Seward jumped at the opportunity. The negotiations were conducted in secret. On March 29, 1816, Russian Minister Edward de Stoeckel and Seward hammered out the treaty, $7.2 million for approximately 586,000 square miles. That works out to about 2 cents per acre. The treaty was signed at 4 a.m. on March 30, 1867, after an all-night negotiating session. The American public and press were merciless. They called it Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox, Wall Russia, and Andrew Johnson's Polar Bear Garden. Political cartoons showed Seward buying icebergs and walruses. The New York Tribune called it a frozen wilderness. The New York World described it as a barren, worthless, God-forsaken region. But Seward had his defenders, and Congress narrowly approved the treaty. The House was less enthusiastic about appropriating the money, and there were allegations that Stoeckel paid bribes to key congressmen. Nevertheless, the money was appropriated, though it took nearly a year. On October 18, 1867, the formal transfer ceremony took place in Sitka. Russian and American soldiers paraded. The Russian flag was lowered, and the American flag was raised, except it got tangled on the way up, requiring a soldier to climb the pole to free it, a mishap that some saw as an inauspicious omen. For the indigenous peoples, it was a transaction conducted entirely without their input. The treaty mentioned them briefly, saying, "The uncivilized tribes will be subject to such laws and regulations as the United States may, from time to time, adopt in regard to aboriginal tribes of that country." They were not consulted, not compensated, and not recognized as having any rights to land they had occupied for thousands of years. For decades, Alaska remained neglected by the American government. It was governed first by the Army, then the Navy, then the Treasury Department. There was no civil government, no real law enforcement, no representation in Congress. It was simply the Department of Alaska, an afterthought. The indigenous population continued to decline from disease. Tlingit society struggled to adapt to the loss of their traditional economy. Russian Aleut Creoles formed a distinct community, caught between Russian heritage and American rule. The few American settlers were mostly prospectors, traders, and adventurers living in a legal gray zone. Alaska seemed destined to remain a frozen backwater. Then, someone found gold. Gold was first discovered in Alaska in 1869. just 2 years after the purchase, but the strikes were small and difficult to reach. That changed in 1890 when prospectors found gold in Canada's Yukon Territory just across the Alaska border. The Klondike Gold Rush was on. Here's what made the Klondike special. The gold was real and abundant, but getting there was an epic ordeal. Most prospectors traveled by ship to the Alaska ports of Skagway or Dai, then faced a brutal trek over the coast mountains through either the Chilkoot Pass or White Pass. Routes so treacherous, they were called the meanest 33 miles in the world. The most famous images of the gold rush show a long line of prospectors climbing the Chilkoot Pass in single file, bent under massive packs. Canadian authorities required each person entering Yukon to bring a year's worth of supplies, about 2,000 pounds of gear. Most men had to make 20 to 30 trips up and down the pass, hauling their outfits in stages. In winter, thousands of men carved steps into the ice, creating a human chain up the mountain. Skagway became a lawless boomtown, virtually overnight, growing from a single homestead to 20,000 people in months. It was controlled by conman Soapy Smith and his gang, who ran everything from rigged gambling to fake telegraph offices. Smith's reign ended in 1898 when he was shot dead in a gunfight with vigilante Frank Reed, who also died from his wounds. Today, both men are a part of Skagway's legend. While the Klondike was technically in Canada, Alaska benefited enormously. Alaska provided the supply routes, the ports, and the infrastructure. Moreover, gold was soon found within Alaska itself, in Nome in 1899, in Fairbanks in 1902, and in numerous other locations. The Nome Gold Rush was particularly unique because gold was literally on the beaches. You didn't need expensive mining equipment, just a shovel and a rocker box. News of beach gold created a stampede. In the summer of 1900, Nome swelled to over 20,000 people, making it Alaska's largest city. They lived in tents on the beach, panning gold from the sand. The gold rushes transformed Alaska. They brought thousands of settlers, created boomtowns, forced the federal government to establish some legal authority, and demonstrated that Alaska's resources could be exploited, though at tremendous environmental and social cost. The rushes also created Alaska's first true multicultural mixing. White Americans and Europeans joined Chinese workers, Japanese fishermen, African American entrepreneurs, and indigenous peoples in the chaotic pursuit of wealth. Some struck it rich, but most didn't. Many stayed anyway, becoming Alaska's pioneer settlers. For Alaska natives, the gold rushes brought devastating changes. Their lands were overrun, game animals were depleted, diseases spread, and their traditional economies collapsed. Unlike in the lower 48, where treaties at least nominally recognized tribal lands, even if regularly violated, Alaska natives had no treaties, no reservations, and no recognized land rights at all. In the early 1900s, Alaska remained a territory with minimal government. It had no voting representation in Congress, no ability to elect its own governor, and limited self-governance. Alaska's population was small, around 64,000 in 1910, with indigenous peoples still comprising the majority. But Alaska was too valuable to ignore completely. The copper deposits near the Wrangell Mountains were among the richest in the world. The Kennecott Copper Mine, operating from 911 to 1938, produced over $200 million in copper and silver. To transport the ore, investors built the Copper River and Northwestern Railway through some of the most difficult terrain imaginable, a 200-mile line that crossed glaciers, canyons, and mountain ranges. Salmon fishing became another major industry. Canneries dotted the coast, processing millions of fish annually. Unfortunately, these industries were largely controlled by outside corporations based in Seattle or San Francisco. Alaska's resources enriched distant investors while locals struggled. In 1912, Alaska finally achieved territorial status, gaining a legislature and a non-voting delegate to Congress. This was progress, but Alaska still lacked the rights enjoyed by states. The early 20th century also saw improved transportation. The completion of the Alaska Railroad in 1923, connecting Seward to Fairbanks, opened the interior to development. Bush pilots became legendary figures, flying supplies and mail to remote communities in conditions that would ground pilots anywhere else. Pilots like Carl Ben Eielson and Noel Wien became heroes, proving that aircraft could operate in Arctic conditions. Then came World War II, and suddenly, Alaska's strategic importance was undeniable. When Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, few Americans realized that Alaska was on the front lines of World War II. The Aleutian Islands stretch so far west that they're closer to Japan than to Seattle. Military planners on both sides recognized Alaska's strategic value. In June 1942, Japanese forces bombed Dutch Harbor in the Aleutians, then invaded and occupied the islands of Attu and Kiska. These were the only parts of North America occupied by enemy forces during World War II. The occupation lasted over a year. The United States poured resources into Alaska. The Alaska Highway was built in an astonishing 8 months in 1942. Over 1,500 miles of road connecting Alaska to the lower 48 through Canada. It was an engineering marvel, built by over 11,000 soldiers working around the clock through brutal conditions. African American regiments comprised about 1/3 of the workforce, facing not only the harsh environment, but also racism and segregation, even in the wilderness. Military bases sprouted across Alaska. Fairbanks and Anchorage transformed from small towns to military hubs. The Lend-Lease program saw thousands of American aircraft delivered to Soviet forces through Alaska. Pilots would fly planes from Montana to Fairbanks, where Soviet pilots would take over for the flight to Russia. The Battle of Attu in May 1943 was brutal. American forces landed to retake the island from Japanese defenders dug into the mountains. Fighting in fog, snow, and mud, American casualties were heavy. The Japanese garrison fought nearly to the last man, with the battle ending in a massive banzai charge. Only 28 Japanese soldiers were captured alive out of a garrison of 2,900. For the Aleut people, the war was catastrophic. The U.S. military evacuated Aleuts from the Aleutians, moving them to internment camps in southeast Alaska where conditions were appalling. They lived in abandoned canneries and mining camps without adequate food, sanitation, or medical care. Many died from disease and malnutrition. Meanwhile, their villages were damaged or destroyed, and their property was looted. This forced relocation was later recognized as a grave injustice, and in 1988, Congress formally apologized and provided compensation to survivors. The war permanently changed Alaska. The population doubled. Infrastructure was built that would have taken decades otherwise. Most importantly, Alaska had proven its strategic importance. It was the northwest corner of American defense against the Soviet Union as the Cold War began. After World War II, Alaska pushed hard for statehood. The territory had proven its loyalty and strategic value. Its population had grown to over 128 by 1950, but statehood faced significant opposition. Some opponents argued Alaska was too remote and sparsely populated. Others worried about cost. Alaska would need massive federal investment in infrastructure. Some business interests opposed statehood because territorial status kept Alaska weak and easier to exploit. And as with Hawaii, some opposed Alaska's statehood for racial reasons, concerned about Alaska Natives and the influence of non-white populations. Alaska had powerful advocates. Delegate Bob Bartlett worked tirelessly in Congress. Ernest Gruening, who served as appointed territorial governor from 1939 to 1953, then as delegate to Congress, crusaded for statehood. A key argument was Cold War strategy. A state would be a stronger bulwark against the Soviet Union than a neglected territory. Alaska's statehood was linked to Hawaii's in congressional debates. Both were non-contiguous. Both faced mainland prejudice, and both were strategic prizes in the Cold War. Eventually, political calculations favored admission. Alaska was perceived as potentially Republican, favoring conservatives, while Hawaii seemed likely Democratic, favoring liberals. Admitting both maintained balance. On June 30, 1958, Congress passed the Alaska Statehood Act. Alaska's voters approved it in August by a 5-to-1 margin. On January 3, 1959, President Dwight Eisenhower signed the proclamation, making Alaska the 49th state, beating Hawaii to statehood by 7 months. The admission ceremony was emotional. The flag was changed to include Alaska's star. Church bells rang across the new state. Alaska had finally achieved political equality with the rest of the nation. But statehood raised critical questions. Who owned Alaska's vast lands? What rights did Alaska Natives have? How would resources be developed and profits shared? In 968, Atlantic Richfield discovered massive oil deposits at Prudhoe Bay on Alaska's North Slope, one of the largest oil fields ever found in North America. The discovery promised unimaginable wealth, but there was a problem. Who owned the land? Alaska Natives had never signed treaties with the United States. Their land rights had never been formally recognized or extinguished. As oil development loomed, Alaska Native leaders organized to demand a settlement of their claims. The result was the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, ANCSA, of 1971, one of the most significant pieces of legislation affecting indigenous peoples in American history. It was also deeply controversial. ANCSA extinguished Aboriginal land claims across Alaska in exchange for $962.5 million and 44 million acres of land, about 11ths of Alaska's total area. But rather than creating reservations, ANCSA created a unique system of native corporations. Alaskan natives would become shareholders in regional and village corporations that would own the land and manage the settlement money. The idea was to give Alaska natives an economic stake in the state's development. In practice, results were mixed. Some corporations thrived, providing dividends and jobs to shareholders. Others struggled or failed. Critics argued the system forced a corporate, capitalist structure onto indigenous communities that might have preferred other arrangements. The oil industry transformed Alaska's economy. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline, completed in 1977, stretches 800 miles from Prudhoe Bay to the port of Valdez, crossing 3 mountain ranges and over 800 rivers and streams. It was an engineering marvel and an environmental controversy. Oil revenue created Alaska's Permanent Fund in 1976, a sovereign wealth fund that invests oil revenues and distributes annual dividends to Alaska residents. Every qualified resident, including children, receives a dividend check each year, typically $1,000, $2,000. It's the closest thing to universal basic income in the United States. Oil money meant Alaska could operate without a state income tax or sales tax while providing extensive public services. It funded schools, roads, airports, and public facilities across a state larger than California, Texas, and Montana combined. But oil dependency created vulnerabilities. When oil prices crashed, Alaska's budget crashed too, and oil is finite. Production has declined since peaking in 1988, raising questions about Alaska's economic future. Today, Alaska remains a land of contradictions. It's America's largest state, but one of its least populated. Roughly 730,000 people scattered across 665 square miles. For comparison, Alaska is 1/5 the size of the entire lower 48 combined. It's overwhelmingly dependent on federal government spending and infrastructure, yet Alaskans often embrace an intensely anti-government, individualist ethos. The frontier mystique remains powerful. Alaska attracts people seeking to escape civilization, test themselves against nature, or simply live differently. Alaska's natural beauty is staggering. Massive glaciers, the aurora borealis, pristine wilderness, abundant wildlife. Tourism has become a major industry, with cruise ships bringing hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. But tourism creates tensions. How do you preserve wilderness when economic survival depends on showing it to people? Climate change is transforming Alaska faster than almost anywhere on Earth. Permafrost is melting, destabilizing buildings and infrastructure. Coastal villages face erosion and flooding, with some communities preparing to relocate entirely. Glaciers are retreating, forests are spreading north, and weather patterns are shifting dramatically. For indigenous communities dependent on traditional hunting and fishing, these changes threaten entire ways of life. Alaska still struggles with significant social problems. Rural Alaska, particularly indigenous villages, faces poverty, lack of health care, substance abuse, domestic violence, and suicide at rates far above national averages. The cost of living in bush villages is extraordinarily high. Food must be flown in, fuel is expensive, and infrastructure is minimal. Alaska natives make up about 15% of the population, but face disproportionate challenges while also maintaining remarkable cultural resilience. Languages are being revitalized, traditional practices preserved, and indigenous knowledge increasingly recognized as valuable, particularly regarding environmental management and climate adaptation. The tension between resource development and environmental protection remains intense. Should the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge be opened to oil drilling? Should the Pebble Mine, which could threaten Bristol Bay's legendary salmon runs, be permitted? Should old growth forests be logged? These aren't abstract debates. They're about Alaska's identity and future. Alaska remains America's last frontier in more than just mythology. It's a place where wilderness still dominates, where nature sets the terms, where the frontier between civilization and the wild remains vivid and real. But Alaska has never been a blank slate for American dreams. It's been home to indigenous peoples for at least 15,000 years. Peoples who not only survived, but thrived in conditions that would kill unprepared outsiders within hours. It was a Russian colonial outpost where Orthodox Christianity merged with native traditions. It was a gold rush destination that attracted fortune seekers from around the world. It was a World War II battlefield where American and Japanese forces fought in the fog. It became an oil producer whose wealth funded a unique social experiment in resource revenue sharing. Alaska's story challenges simple narratives about American expansion. Yes, Seward's Folly turned into an incredible bargain for the United States. But it was only a bargain because indigenous peoples' rights were ignored and their lands were taken without consent or compensation. Alaska's wealth came from its resources, but extracting those resources always carried environmental and social costs. Today, Alaska faces an uncertain future. Oil production is declining, climate change is accelerating, and difficult choices loom about how to preserve both economic vitality and environmental integrity. Alaska natives continue fighting to protect traditional lands and ways of life while navigating a modern economy. Rural and urban Alaska often seem like different worlds, divided by hundreds of miles and radically different ways of life. Yet Alaska retains something increasingly rare in modern America: genuine wildness. More than 60% of Alaska's land is federally protected in some form: national parks, wildlife refuges, wilderness areas. The state has more coastline than all other U.S. states combined. It's home to grizzly bears, wolves, caribou herds, and millions of seabirds. In Alaska, you can still experience nature on a scale that seems impossible in the lower 48. The Alaskan motto is North to the Future. It acknowledges that Alaska has always been about what might be possible rather than what already is. A land of potential, danger, and promise. From indigenous peoples who created sophisticated civilizations in the Arctic, to Russian fur traders who pushed imperial borders to the edge of the known world, to American prospectors seeking gold, to modern residents balancing tradition with change, Alaska has always been a place where people tested themselves against extraordinary challenges. Alaska is not a finished story. It's still being written by Alaska natives reclaiming their heritage, by immigrants seeking new opportunities, by scientists studying climate change, by adventurers drawn to the north, and by longtime residents trying to preserve what makes Alaska special while adapting to an uncertain future. In a world that sometimes feels completely mapped, measured, and controlled, Alaska reminds us that genuine wilderness still exists, that nature can still humble humanity, and that the frontier, in all its danger, beauty, and possibility, isn't entirely closed. Alaska remains America's last frontier, not because it's the last place we claimed, but because it's still fundamentally wild, still resisting complete domestication, still reminding us that some forces, the cold, the dark, the wild, remain beyond human control. And perhaps that's exactly what makes it invaluable.